So our two speakers today are Oneg Ben-Dror, who is a project coordinator in the Prisoners and Detainees Department at PHRI, focusing on systemic human rights violations in Israeli prisons, especially the right to health, mental health in prison, solitary confinement, and access to justice. She is the co-author of the first report on the Sde Teiman military detention facility, of the report Unlawfully Detained, Tortured, and Starved, the Plight of Gaza's Medical Workers in Israeli Custody, and of our recent report, which we will discuss today, Death of Palestinians in Israeli Custody, Enforced Disappearance, Systemic Killing, and Cover-ups. We are also joined by advocate Nadia Daqqa, who I'm very happy to have with us here today. She is an experienced human rights lawyer with special expertise in representing Palestinians in in the Israeli incarceration system. And I'm especially glad to have her with us here today because we work together at my first human rights job here at Hamoked, which is another great human rights organization. So it's nice to see you again. So, to start us off, Oneg, before we kind of delve into the particularities of our report and deaths in custody, can you please help us by setting the scene a little bit? Can you provide some background about the Israeli incarceration system and how the conditions and policies have changed since October 2023?
Sure. Before October 2023, and for decades, there has been political persecutions against Palestinians and the wholesale arrests of Palestinians. Already then, it was practically at least one from every family, which is another tool that Israel is using to oppress the Palestinian people by restricting their freedom. What happened since October 2023 and as part of the genocide is that all the Israeli detention facilities that are holding Palestinians have become torture facilities. It's an Israeli policy against Palestinians in custody that basically saying that restricting their freedom is not enough, but also adding another level of punishment through the conditions. So for more than 2 years, Palestinians in Israeli custody are being tortured, starved, denied medical care, and any contact with their families. Holding them in those facilities has become another horrifying tool of oppression, torture, and direct killing. If we look if we look at numbers before October 2023, the number of Palestinians held under administrative detention reached 1,200. Then it was the highest number in 20 years, 1,200 of people imprisoned without trial. Now there are almost 3,500 administrative detainees and another 1,200 detainees from Gaza who are held also without charges under different form of administrative detention. That means that 50% of Palestinians in Israeli custody are held without trial. In the past 2 years, in short, Israel is disappearing Palestinians, starving them, abusing them, sexually assaulting them, and violating every basic right of Palestinians in Israeli custody. And it has become an official and acceptable policy.
Thank you, Oneg. Nadia, as an attorney who has been visiting incarcerated Palestinians in the Israeli detention centers for many years now, can you please walk us through the process? Why are these visits so important? How do they work in practice? What does a visit look like? And what has changed in the last 2 years?
Okay, good evening, everyone. First of all, I will give you a short background. We are talking about a group of detainees who, by definition, are meant to be cut off from the outside world. This was the situation even before the war. And since the second Intifada, detainees classified as security prisoners, classification that applies only to Palestinians, since Jewish detainees classified as security prisoners receive a different treatment, have been allowed at best to receive visits only from first-degree family members and only subject to approval by the army and the prison services. So these family visits were limited to once or twice a month at most for a maximum of 45 minutes. The visit took place behind the physical barrier and with communication conducted through a telephone. ensuring that there was no physical contact between the detainee and their family member. And under these conditions, lawyers' visits became a crucial tool for monitoring the protection of detainees' rights that time. With the outbreak of the most recent war, family visits were completely suspended, which made our visit as lawyers absolutely critical. And despite the clear importance of lawyers' meetings with their clients, the IPS began implementing kind of an undeclared policy that made it extremely difficult for lawyers to meet their clients, and all of whom in our cases were security detainees, Palestinian detainees. And despite the delays and the obstacles in coordinating and conducting these visits, we eventually began entering the various prisons a month later. And what we encountered was really horrifying. Behind the declaration of a state of emergency, we discovered systematic violation of the most basic rights of detainees. They were completely cut off from the outside world, no contact with families, no books, no letters, no news, and no knowledge of what was happening at that time outside. We also discovered that all the detainees were being deliberately starved. Over time, it became clear that this was not incidental, but a clear policy implemented with the backing of the Minister Ben-Gvir. Detainees who required basic medications, so their requests ignored, and clothing and hygiene products were not provided in a manner that preserves human dignity. This was a wide-ranging system of violation that could not have been uncovered without the lawyers' visits. And Israeli courts refused to allow lawyers to file general petition addressing this systematic violation, even though the issues were not tied to a specific individual or specific prisoners. These were clearly systemic abuses, but the court insisted on addressing these appeals only individual individual petitions. In order to file such petition, we were required to meet each detainee to conduct the visit and to obtain their consent to file a petition on their behalf regarding the violation of their rights, even though each person was part of a much larger affected group and not by himself. He had this violation. All the group of these detainees had the same violation, and so we had this way, just this way, to deal with this violation. And only in this way we were able to make these changes. And I have to admit that the changes were minor in comparison to the cruelty of the violation we faced and continue to face today. However, the accumulation of individual petitions did, in some cases, or lead to minor systematic change. One example is the outbreak of scabies, which physicians for human rights encountered in many cases. The disease developed due to extremely poor sanitary conditions and the prison services' refusal to improve these conditions. And this despite the repeated appeals and despite a long series of petitions filed by many lawyers. And our continued monitoring as lawyers allowed us to track the spread of the disease and to understand the full scope of the medical and sanitary neglect. Unfortunately, I cannot say that we managed to eradicate the disease, but we did partially succeed in securing treatment and recovery for hundreds, if not thousands, of detainees. The policy eventually changed and medical treatment began to be provided after the issue had initially been almost entirely ignored. Today, treatment is provided, sometimes with delays, and the cleanliness conditions of the facilities and of the detainees themselves have not improved in a way that would contribute to fully eliminating the disease. This is just one example that illustrates the critical importance of these visits. I would like to add very shortly another aspect to the importance of lawyers' visits since 2023. Thousands of detainees from the Gaza Strip have been held in custody. At the beginning, they were held in conditions of absolute enforced disappearance. And unfortunately, this occurred with the passive acceptance of the Israeli courts. After extensive legal proceedings, these visits were eventually permitted. And beyond the professional and legal aspects of these visits, another crucial element emerged at this level, the human one. At the end of the day, we are lawyers, but first and foremost, we are human beings. And when you meet a person who left their entire family behind in the hell of the war, that visit allows them to understand that their family members are alive and someone has reached out to a lawyer in order to visit him. That alone caused many detainees to break down in tears because it was the first sign of life they had received from their families. And when the goal of the system is to isolate detainees completely and to operate in a manner that violates the minimal standards of detention as defined under international law, it becomes very easy to understand why the system placed obstacles in the way of lawyers accessing prisons. And indeed, they succeeded in delaying our work. It is no coincidence that around 50 lawyers were prevented during this period from entering prisons for extended lengths of time, a fact that itself demonstrates the importance of this visit and the critical role in exposing and challenging detention conditions.
Thank you, Nadia. I didn't realize actually that for many people that was, in a way, the only way to know that their family was okay and looking out for them. So very interesting and sad to hear. And just to add on the point of isolation from the outside world, I think it's worth noting two other important forms of isolation. One is that the International Committee of the Red Cross used to have regular visitation rights to detention facilities where Palestinians were being held up until the beginning of the war. And the Israeli authorities have denied this right since the beginning of the war. And we at Physicians for Human Rights and some other organizations have ongoing high court litigation on this issue. And another element, which my understanding from my colleagues in our detainees department was already reducing significantly, but we used to sometimes send physicians, not just lawyers, to visit incarcerated people with health problems or health complaints. And that has become almost completely impossible. We've managed, I think, Oneg, correct me if I'm wrong, to send in one doctor since the beginning of the war, and even that was quite recently. So it really is a system designed to isolate people and disappear them. So Nadia, just one follow-up question, and you touched on some of these issues already, but we're about to hear from Oneg about PHRI's recent report on this dramatic spike in deaths by incarcerated Palestinians. Is there anything that you saw or heard during your visits that can explain to you instinctively, without looking at the numbers, how and why this is happening?
Okay, I can say that medical neglect is one of the central issues. Even before the war, deaths in prisons occurred at a frequency that cannot be described as normal. However, the dramatic increase over the past 2 years is a direct result of the emergency policies that led to systematic deterioration in detention conditions, including access to doctors in a way that ensures proper medical care. This occurred even in cases involving individuals who were already ill and whose medical condition were well known to the IPS. Another recurring pattern we documented was the systematic use of violence against detainees. We documented prisoners who reported broken arms and legs as a result of violence by prison guards, injuries that were never treated. They received no medical care, and the fractures healed on their own, sometimes improperly, and with the permanent damage. There were also cases in which people died as a direct result of violence and under torture. There was a general problem with access to medical treatment, and in many cases, this happened because that detainees who repeatedly requested to see a doctor or who were taken to the clinic were subjected to violence by guards. So, as a result, many detainees choose not to request medical care at all in order to avoid exposure to violence. There were cases in which people died following the progression of treatable illnesses where medical neglect directly led to death. This included cases of detainees who died from infection that developed from untreated scabies, for example. I personally I represented in a case where a minor who was arrested while healthy, an athletic child, and who died in prison a few months later the detention. The autopsy revealed that he had suffered from prolonged starvation, which severely weakened his immune system. His death was caused by an infection that his body was no longer able to fight due to his deteriorated condition. All of these events I have described before are the direct result of the policies in place, whether through the starvation of the detainees, the neglect of their health, or the direct physical torture they endured.
Thank you. Um, so with that background and build up, Oneg, I'd like to dive now into PHRI's recent report on this alarming rise in deaths, which we're already starting to get an idea of how this came about. To start, could you share some background on why your department decided that this report needed to be written?
Sure, and I would like to echo what Nadia just said. PHRI and other organizations documented thousands of cases of torture, either by withholding medical care or by direct physical assaults. And the death cases are the most blatant proof of the reality and the information we have revealed. Therefore, it was important that these unfortunate cases be revealed in order also to leave no room for the doubt that the state of Israel has turned the detention facilities into facilities of torture and killing, and that the policy not only harms the health and well-being of Palestinians, but also their lives. So we are talking about a declared policy of executions and death penalty already implemented on the ground, in which the life of every Palestinian who is being taken to the Israeli detention facilities, whether it's an older person or young with pre-existing health issues or healthy, is in grave danger. In the report, we talked about at least 94 Palestinians who died in Israeli custody from October 2023 and until August 2025. Since then, already 6 Palestinians died in Israeli custody, and the last one only today. Sakel Zaul, we'll talk about him later, 26-year-old from Bethlehem, from Husania, Bethlehem. Anyway, it brings the death toll of Palestinians in Israeli custody to at least 100 since October 2023. It's unprecedented number and the highest that we know so far. It is also more than the number of Palestinians who died in Israeli custody in the decade before, which is less than 30. And it doesn't stop. In addition, the information we gathered in the report shows that the Israeli authorities do not intend to truly investigate the deaths or bring the criminals to justice. Therefore, to trial. Therefore, the report and the information we provided is of great importance in bringing about accountability and justice for the victims.
Okay, so now let's dive into the actual report. Oneg, can you share a little bit about the methodology that you use to gather the information and write the report? And aside from the number of deaths that you addressed, can you share a little bit about the report's findings?
So the report is based on extensive cross-referencing of multiple sources, responses to freedom of information requests, analysis of autopsy reports attended by family-appointed physician, medical files of prisoners' review by PHRI prior to their death, medical complaints handled by the organization, testimonies from former detainees, medical staff who witnessed death in custody, and information collected from other organizations. The report and the annex of the report also provides more data on 73 cases. And they are organized by detention facilities and serve to assist in identifying the authorities and the official responsible for this death. We spoke earlier about the number of at least 100 Palestinians who died in Israeli custody, and I want to explain why we emphasize that it's at least. And the reason is that we believe that the actual number is much higher than that. And this is because of the policy that Nadia and also Lee spoke before of enforced disappearance that Israel is applying against Palestinians detainees from Gaza. In the first 7 months of the genocide, it wasn't possible to receive any information about the whereabouts of detainees from Gaza. And since then, we and other organizations continue to receive hundreds of responses from the Israeli army stating that there is no indication for the detention of the specific individual. So it's basically a continuation of this policy of enforced disappearance. Even in cases that there are documentation and witnesses for the detention, we received, for example, this answer in the case of Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, that was well documented, unlike others, and also Amuked, organization you worked before and mentioned, worked on a case of a father and a son, Munir and Yassin al-Fakawi, who were taken from their house in front of family members, and they were used as human shields. The family and through lawyers tried for several months to receive information about the whereabouts, and the Israeli army gave that answer of no indication for the arrest of them until they brought to the Supreme Court a testimony of a person who was detained with them and was used as a human shield together with them. And only then the Israeli army admitted that they were held in custody and that they died in custody. Besides the unprecedented number, the report also shows the extent and how widespread the death cases are in almost all detention facilities that Israel is holding Palestinians. It also shows that it didn't happen in one period and stop, but it keeps going. It keeps happening for more than 2 years, with an average of 4 deaths in a month. And this is why we call it systemic killing. Also in the report, out of 94 in the report, 42 deaths occur under the custody of the Israel Prison Service and 52 under the custody of the Israeli army. An examination of 10 autopsy reports, and I will later will tell why not of more. It's because of the Israeli policy. Showed evidence of physical violence in half of the cases, including head injuries, internal bleeding, and fractured ribs. 6 reports documented extreme medical neglect, cases of severe malnutrition, denial of insulin to diabetic prisoners, and failure to treat cancer and life-threatening infections. In other cases, where physicians weren't able to attend autopsies, but there are testimonies and we examined medical files show the same long-lasting pattern of brutal violence by guards combined with severe medical neglect and malnutrition. Ahmad Ihdirat, he was a 19 years old who suffered from diabetic and needed insulin 3 times a day. He died last month in Ktsiot prison because he didn't receive the care he needed. You know, we are in 2025, 19 years old shouldn't die from diabetes. Mohammed al-Sabar died in Ofer prison in February 2024 after he didn't receive the medical he needed for his intestinal disease, which was a simple thing, an adjusted diet. He suffered for weeks until he passed away. Abdelrahman El-Mari died in Megiddo prison in November 2023, and Mohammed Hussein died in December 2024 in Kishon detention facility. They both died after suffering from physical assault. This finding was also aligned with broader evidence, as I said, collected by PHRI and other organizations about this policy of torture, starvation, and denial of medical care. I want to say something also about the last part of the report, which is about the cover-ups by the Israeli authorities of the death cases. The cover-ups start from not transferring body to the National Forensic Institute. For example, we know from an answer to a Freedom of Information request that from October 2023 and until March 2024, when at least 35 Palestinians died under the custody of the Israeli army didn't transfer anybody to the National Forensic Institute. And there was a case that was transferred a month after the person has died, several months after, and that happened only because of the request of the family to perform an autopsy. The other another part of the cover-ups is that families often go weeks and even months without being informed of their relative deaths. There are still families in Gaza that don't know that their relatives and beloved died under the Israeli army. And sometimes they learn about it from the media. Even when families are informed, in several cases, they weren't notified in time, so they couldn't send a doctor to observe the autopsy on their behalf, a right that they have. Or the police didn't transfer to the Forensic Institute the request of the family that was submitted to court by the attorney to attend the autopsy. Another aspect is that the autopsies are frequently delayed, and the average of performing autopsies is about 14 days after the person died, while the recommended time in literature is no later than a week. There was a case that the police transferred to the Forensic Institute a month after the death occurred, and there the Forensic Institute said that there was no point in performing an autopsy at that stage, and autopsy wouldn't be able to determine the cause of death, and because of that, there was no autopsy. And even after all of that, even in cases that an autopsy was performed, and even there was a physician attended on behalf of the family, to the date and to the best of our knowledge, not a single soldier, prison guard, or IPS doctor has been indicted, even in cases that happened more than 2 years ago, and there were clear evidence of severe violence and medical neglect.
So it sounds pretty clear that we're speaking about a situation of pretty clear impunity and lack of kind of many effective outlets for the victims and their families. But still, I would like to ask you, Nadia, after this overview of the gravity of the situation, as a lawyer who represents incarcerated Palestinians before the Israeli legal system, what are the prospects of accountability for these difficult cases? And is there anything a family can do in such a case before the Israeli legal system if they do learn how their loved one died, is there anything they can do?
Okay, so at this moment, turning to the Israeli judicial system is a very complex question. Throughout the war, we have seen how difficult it is to challenge policies that clearly cry out illegality. Even individual legal proceedings have rarely succeeded, and in some cases, it was evident and very evident that the Israeli judicial system provided silent backing to these policies. We saw this in petition addressing the starvation of the detainees, in petitions concerning the enforced disappearance of detainees from Gaza, and in petitions seeking to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross access to prisons. And when I reflect on these cases, I believe that there is still importance in pursuing legal proceeding within the Israeli judicial system, because through these processes, we are able to obtain information about the cases themselves. This is crucial if there is an intention to continue through international legal channels. For example, deaths in custody must be closely monitored. And as Oneg said, it is essential to insist on investigative proceedings into the causes of death. Through such processes, it is possible to obtain access to medical records, pathological findings, and information regarding how investigations are conducted and the extent to which the state is genuinely committed to uncovering the truths. Since we are dealing here with a systemic issue and not the responsibility of a specific individual for the death of another person, but the responsibility of the system and the general policies that led to the death or to the fatal outcomes, it is essential to investigate all such cases in order to establish a kind of evidentiary foundation. In such cases, I recommend requesting autopsies and the whole process, and to do the whole process in order to obtain the full information. The experience shows that the Israeli system does not seriously address this in custody, and whether by intent or by negligence, it is committing an offense that must be brought to an end. And I think the international legal channels are the best way to do that.
Okay, so before we move on to the last question that I had planned to ask you both, we have some interesting questions in the chat, which we have a few minutes to address. This is a question, I think, for either of you, if you want to touch on it. Can you touch on the consequences for lawyers and physicians who are active in documentation and defense of victims? I would broaden that, Oneg, if you want to even speak as a non-lawyer and non-physician,
I
simply as a
think
human rights
Nadia.
activist.
Okay, the consequences are like I talked about that before. Many of the lawyers who are involved in this work were banned to enter the prisons. We are talking about 52 lawyers till now in the period of 2 years. I was one of them. I just recently returned to visit in prisons, and in this way they just blocked my access to my clients and blocked my possibility and ability to represent these people. So and this also affect my work itself. So there are a lot of consequences. They also like I cannot talk about physicians, but from our perspective as lawyers, yes, many of us also were monitored by Israeli right wings as people who are involved in such a terror war, a kind of terror work, or we are using the court and the legal system as a terror tool, and they איך אומרים, פוגעים בשמנו הטוב, ברכה לי המילה.
Harm our reputation, damage our
Yes,
reputation.
they try all the time to harm our reputation by making this connection between us and our clients. So these are the consequences for now. I hope to to don't see any progression in this issue. Yeah.
So now the questions are really starting to come in. I'll try to take a few more as we still have a little bit of time. One question that we often get at this sort of conversation, but is connected, I think, to the consequences at the bureaucratic level, is how do you manage to remain sane and functioning doing this work? How do you feel about the apathy of the Israeli public to the plight of Palestinians? So I think it's kind of taking things from the external level to the internal level of what are the consequences of doing this kind of work. And I mean, I can say that for me, the main consequence is an aversion to the society that I live in because I am Jewish Israeli, and I feel uh, increasingly isolated and in a little tiny sub community where I can speak what I think and be honest and open. And pretty much in any public interaction, I'm afraid of people's reactions if I say where I work and what I do. And I know that there are real efforts by the authorities to try and stop us from doing that work. So you become very defensive. So that's just my take on it. If one of you would like to answer too.
I can just say that I think in large for the Israeli public, the issue of Palestinian detainees, because of the level of dehumanization, it's either doesn't interest them, or if it does, only to the level that they support this policy that we described earlier of torture and starvation and denial of medical care and of killing of Palestinians in custody. I can give another example of a rape case in Sde. In the Israeli public, it was discussed a lot, but not about the rape case, but about the soldiers being indicted and about right wingers entering the military base, but not about the rape case itself. And I would say that it's not the only rape case. There are several of rape cases and sexual assaults that we know of. This is the only case that was brought up because the person was reached a life-threatening condition after the rape, and he was needed to be hospitalized. And this is how more people came to know about the case. But yeah.
So I think this is a good lead up to the next two questions that are related, which is, can you tell us something about the complicity of physicians in these violations, or conversely, cases where physicians were instrumental in unveiling and reporting grave torture and rights violations?
I can say about the physicians in prison. First of all, what we saw is from October 2023 and until February 2024, all the clinics for Palestinians in detention facilities where Israel is holding Palestinians for political reasons were closed. And while they were still open in other facilities, for, let's say, criminal charges. For Palestinians, they stopped, and many inquiries and letters to the medical care in prison and to the health ministry and to the Israel Medical Associations brought nothing. Also, Palestinians, they weren't, many hospitals refused to admit Palestinian detainees. Um, and when they were admitted, there are still hospitals that refuse, by the way. And when when they are admitted, they are handcuffed, sometimes also blindfolded. They often being treated inside rooms with not the equipment, the necessary equipment, and often they are being discharged much earlier on, even after complicated procedures. Um, and from testimonies of whistleblowers, we learned that also physicians were speaking about some were refusing to treat Palestinians hospitalized in hospitals. Some who did treat them said that they are willing to treat them just in order to keep them alive, so Israel can interrogate them. And maybe one of the most severe cases that we witness is the field hospital that was established in Sde in torture camps. Physicians could hear the screamings, could see. They were treating Palestinians who were assaulted. And inside the facility, the field hospital, also they were handcuffed the whole time. There was no consent, no translation, so no consent. Medical students described that they wanted to come there because it was, they said it's heaven for practice, because they could perform their proceeding that they are not certified for. Yeah, and also another thing is that when we tried to again to get the Israeli Medical Association and the Israeli Health Minister to be involved in what happens in Israeli detention facilities, we received the response that there was no problem with the standards and the ethics of the physicians there.
So I think there's time for one or two more questions from the chat, and then we'll take our concluding question. This is a question maybe more for Nadia, but maybe also you can answer it, Oneg. Can you also say something about facilities and treatment of women in detention?
Okay, the situation is very similar in they experience problems with getting medical care. They have also, like, I can say that the women are not treated according to the international law, and there is, how to say that, the speciality of the case of women inside the incarceration system are not something that they are sensitive to in the IPS. So I can say that many women had the problem getting
Hygiene.
hygiene, yeah, yeah. They all the time ask for that, and they are not getting that. Other cases of women that suffer from problems, medical problems, and they need like to see a doctor on a high frequency, are not getting this kind of medical care. I should say that many of these women are in administrative detention. according to the Israeli law, they are supposed to get at least a visit to the clinic inside the prison itself, at least once a month, and this is not happening. We are talking about people who are women who are in prison, are deprived of their freedom according to an arbitrary or an administrative order. And although this situation, they are not getting their very basic rights according to the Israeli law itself. So the situation is very similar to what is happening in the other places, and I add to it the problems that are related to the woman as being woman inside the incarceration system, which is not a place who was built and in order to deal with women and to held in women.
The questions are still coming in. I think we'll only take one more and then we'll move on to our final question. How can ordinary citizens from the international community help to end these violations of international humanitarian law and human rights in Israel? So I'll say my 2 cents about this, and then I'm curious to hear what both of you think. But um, I think this is the question of the ages because I don't think any of us could have predicted 3 years ago that we would see the entire international rules-based order collapsing around the idea that Israeli war criminals could be brought to justice by the ICC. And the space and scope for demanding accountability is infuriatingly, frustratingly, depressingly narrow. But I think that uh, people here hear your solidarity and people here hear that you're not willing to drop these issues. And I think that's super, super important to keep things on the agenda, not let the world move on as if the ceasefire means that everything ended. Keep talking about the horrific conditions in Israeli detention centers. Keep speaking about the unimaginably horrible situation in Gaza and the West Bank. Keep campaigning, keep writing media articles, and keep bringing these issues up with your local decision makers. If you're in a country that still has some way of speaking to Israel and encouraging change. And lastly, I wouldn't be a fundraiser if I didn't also say we in the local community of organizations really need your support right now beyond just funds, which we definitely need more than ever. I can say in my department, anytime we receive a particularly uplifting or touching message from somebody who donates to us, we share it with our staff, and it really actually helps right now to hear from people when you feel like you're so isolated where we are, and that people either don't care or don't or support these horrible things. There's something to being told by the rest of the wide world out there, you're not the crazy ones. You're trying to help human beings. It actually matters.
I also want to say something about that. Also, to echo what Lee just said about keeping it on the agenda, not to let the so-called ceasefire to let people forget that it didn't stop. It keeps going in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Israeli detention facilities. And I want to say also, going back to the questions about the role of physicians, I want to add something and also to connect to what other people in other places can do. I want to add that it became the providing medical care or withholding medical care. The medical care became another tool of torture in Israeli detention facilities. As Nadia described earlier, people are being tortured by scabies that eats their skin for months, and they are getting infections because of that. We know a case of a person who was paralyzed because he didn't get the medical care he needed for scabies. And also with the death cases, we see the amount of people who didn't get the very simple medical care as insulin 3 times a day and as an adjusted diet and many others. And they die because of that.
I want just to add very shortly that I think also, I believe it is still important to involve the international community, and that's particularly on the social and legal levels. The legal process is a very slow procedure, and I think it's the only way we can, or it's something that has the potential to achieve the desired results in our cases. Just we need to be more patient.
Okay, so we're running out of time, and I did want to ask both of you one last question. As we approach the end of this conversation, I wanted to ask how you think the next few months are going to play out in the Israeli detention system. Few months, years. Do you think we can expect any improvement in these policies and the conditions people are living through? Do you expect more of the same, more denial of medical treatment, more overcrowding, more abuse? Do you think the death toll will continue to rise?
Nadia, do you want to start?
Okay. Yes, we are already in the period after the war, and everything continues. Deaths in custody are occurring at the same frequency. And just a few days ago, a young man died in prison, and today another death was reported. Unfortunately, I see no intention to bring an end to what is happening. Legal efforts continue. But there is no willingness, neither within the IPS nor within the Ministry of National Security, Ben-Dror, to change the existing reality. These days, there is a public discussion about advancing legislation on the death penalty. In my view, if we look at what has taken place over the past 2 years, it shows that the death penalty has already been implemented de facto. The promotion of this legislation reflects a lack of willingness to change the situation. It provides legal backing for the existing reality. And in the absence of pressure from outside the domestic judicial system, on the domestic judicial system, it is difficult to see how anything will change in the near future. In several recent visits, we heard from detainees that conditions have deteriorated on multiple fronts, including renewed and worsening starvation. This is occurring even after the court the High Court finally ruled that the policy regarding food provision must be changed in order to meet international standards. Even when a court ruling exists, the system refuses to implement it. And we are now facing a concept of court motion whose outcome remains uncertain. And I don't know what will happen with that. Without a real desire to change and without an initiative to do so, and under the current circumstances, I do not see this coming from within. There is no alternative but to rely on international channels to seek a kind of end to this ongoing abuse.
Yeah, we've tried to put an end to these policies in many ways. Unfortunately, in large, it didn't stop. And it keeps going with total impunity. As Nadia said, only today we learned about the death of Saker Zaul, a 26 years old from Hussan in the West Bank, who died in Ofra prison. Last week, Abdel Rahman, El Pastin, 21 years old from the same town, whose son died also after he was held in Offer prison. It's hard to imagine what will happen, but with the finding of the report and the ongoing failure of the Israeli enforcement to prosecute those responsible and unwilling, and turning the Israeli law itself to a fig leaf and a tool of concealment and cover up. And really, the data collected in this report underlines the urgent need for an independent international investigation to end this policy and ensure accountability for those responsible. Without outside pressure, we don't believe that it will change and that the justice will be brought to the victims.
Thank you both very, very much, Nadia and Oneg, for this really compelling conversation. It's amazing to me that even though I read the report and consumed this content all day, you can still bring shocking information I wasn't aware of. So I hope that everybody here learned and found the conversation engaging. I'm sorry if we didn't find the time to reply to your question, but feel free to reach out to us through our contact form, and we'd be happy to keep the conversation going. I admit it's a little bit difficult to find a positive note on which to end this sort of conversation. So maybe I will just say that at least there is value to standing in solidarity with victims and exposing what is happening and bringing the truth to the world. And with that, I will